animations, and animations are ultimately quite simple. You basically always play images in a sequence. The issue with that is that there are two ways to store all of these images. You can either have separate images, or you can have what is called a sprite sheet. For this project, we are going to work with both. So let's have a quick look at what we have inside of our graphics folder. If you look on the left, there we have graphics, and in there we have all of the folders. If you look inside of lights, there we have a fan animation. And these are just individual images that we want to play in sequence. So we just have about 48 different images. It goes from 0 to 47. Alternatively, what we also have, if I minimize the lights and look at explosions, there we have just 3 images. And if I look at one of these images in a bit more detail, you can see that we have 1 images with lots of individual images on top of it. Essentially, what we want to do is to pick individual parts from that. So this is another thing we have to figure out. And this sprite I don't want to have in the scene. But the main thing you have to understand is that we have to pick individual parts of these images. Like anything else in Godot, what we have to use are different nodes. Godot can cover both, but you are using different nodes for each. If you have separate images, you would use an animated sprite 2D. It works kind of like a sprite, so the node we have already seen, except it wants multiple textures instead of a single one. If you have a sprite sheet, you would use the normal sprite 2D, because that one has an animation tab, which allows you to pick specific parts of a larger image. Back in Godot, first of all, I want to close the steam vent, the simple light, and the wall light. We don't need those anymore. Instead, I want to create a new scene. And for this new scene, we have another root node. And this root node is going to be an animated sprite 2D. If I double click on that, we get an animated sprite 2D along with a warning. The warning being that we are going to need sprite frames as a resource. I'm going to cover that in a second. First of all, though, I want to rename this, and let's call it light fan animation. To work with this kind of animated sprite, you want to look on the right under animations, because there we have sprite frames. And right now it's empty, which is what Godot really does not like. To fix that, we have to click on it and then new sprite frames. If you have that, nothing changes. But if you click on it again, now we get another kind of editor. In here, on the left side, we can set a couple of animations. Right now, we only have default, and this is what I want to keep. You could rename it though if you double click on it. But on top of that, you could also add new ones with this icon. So if you want to have multiple animations, this is how you would use that. Although in my case, I want to delete these new animations because we don't need any of that. Instead, I want to look at lights, and in there we have the fan animation. And this contains all of the images. And all of these images I want to drag into these animation frames. And there you can see we have lots of textures. Once you have that, you can click on this play icon, and then we are getting an animation. Right now, it's looking really choppy because we only have 5 frames per second. If I change this to 24, then we have a much smoother animation. And well, this is kind of all you have to know about the basics of animated sprites. They basically work like sprites in animation. And there you can, and this contains, don't need any of that. Instead, I want to look at lights, and in there we have the fan animation. And this contains all of the images. And all of these images I want to drag into these animation frames. And there you can see we have lots of textures. Once you have that, you can click on this play icon, and then we are getting an animation. Right now, it's looking really choppy because we only have 5 frames per second. If I change this to 24, then we have a much smoother animation. And well, this is kind of all you have to know about the basics of animated sprites. They basically work like sprites, but instead of one texture, you are working with sprite frames where you have multiple textures. That's pretty much it. And with that, I can save all of that. Let's say under scenes, I want to save this. I guess objects also work, although this folder is getting quite crowded, but it works for this one. And now that we have that, I want to look at the level, and now we can add inside of the ground node 2D, the light fan animation. And this we can move around, and there we get the same issue again that we have seen in the last part, that right now I want to grab the light fan animation, but we have lots of stuff on top, which makes all of this a bit annoying to work with. So because of that, I want to lock projectiles and I want to lock the gate. With that, I should be able to drag the fan animation, and there we go. This is feeling better. And let's just say I want to have it somewhere in here. And don't forget to enable it so it plays. And then I can run the game and move towards this area. And there we should have, well, we don't have an animation, but at the very least we have an image. The reason why that didn't work is because we have to click on this icon, which says autoplay on load. And now I can run all of this. And if I get to the area, we now have the animation. So this is what we actually wanted. And well, with that, we have pretty much all we need for this kind of node. On top of that, you could also grab this node and transform it. For example, we could change the scale and double it in size. If I save it now, we get a much larger one. Let me move it a bit further to the middle, and there. I think this is looking okay. Now, this light fan animation, you can also target in code quite easily, and we actually haven't written code in a while, and for this one, we still don't need it. But once again, the main thing you want to do in there is you could update the animation. In our case, we don't need it because we only have a single one. If you want to update the animation, you would simply the animation property. Cool, but this is the first kind of animation that you could be working with. It's super easy. I guess while we are here, we could also add another smaller thing. And that is, with the light fan selected, I want to add a point light 2D. For this one, once again, I want to look at the lights. There we have textures, and then drag circle.png. Not what I meant to do. I want to drag circle.png into the texture. And now we can make all of this quite a bit brighter. Let me change the texture scale and the energy. And now if I save this, we get even more light inside of this area. This might be a bit too much, so a lot less energy. Now let's save it. And there we get another kind of effect. Importantly for this one, you do not want to have shadows. With that, we have the first kind of animation along with a bit of light. Next up, I want to add the explosions. And this I want to do inside of the grenades. So basically right now, we only have grenades that work like hockey pucks. They just move, but they don't explode. Let's work on that a bit more. Which means with Control or Command Shift and O, I want to open the grenade. And here you can see we have a grenade, we have a sprite 2D, and a collision shape. So basically nothing is happening. To work on that a bit more, I want to add the animation, and this is in a sprite sheet. Let me, before I add the node, look at this. So instead of explosions, we have, let's say, explosion 2, and zoom out. We have one image that contains a huge amount of smaller images. And basically what we want to do is to pick individual parts from that and then play them in sequence. For that, we can use a normal sprite 2D, the node we have already used many, many times. Because in there, in the inspector, we have animations. This one has a few properties. We have H frames, V frames, and then frame. If I increase the number, you can see quite well what this is doing. If I change this to 2, we are cutting the entire thing in half. And if I increase the number even further, at some point, we are down to 1 column. And let me draw on this, that should be easier to explain. When you look at this image, you notice that we basically have columns like so, and then we have rows like so. In total, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 columns. And I think the same amount of rows. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 indeed. What H-frames and V-frames want is the amount of columns and rows that we have. H-frames covers the columns and V-frames covers the rows. Which means in our case, we have 8 columns and 8 rows. And you can already see, I can zoom in now, and we can't see anything because the very first frame doesn't have any kind of image. And I should show my mouse. You can see it. Right now, we are splitting up the image into 8 columns and 8 rows. And currently, we have the first item selected, which doesn't have anything, so we can't see anything at all right now. But if I increase this number, at some point, we get an image, and the higher the frame number is, the further we get in the animation. And I can click on this faster, and then we cycle through the animation. That's literally all that's happening in here. So if you cycle around, you have the animation. You can even be a bit more specific because under there, we have another attribute called frame coordinates. There you can target the column and the row more specifically. For example, if I set the frame back to 0, we get X and Y being 0. But if I change this frame to, let's say, 2, then we move X to 2, but we stay on the first row. I hope the system makes sense. If you play around with it, it should be fairly straightforward. Now though, we have another issue, and that is none of this.
But I need to remember how the breakies one work, because there is an animation and you can cut them. Let me watch it back. Oh, okay. Okay, I understand. It work for this. I want to add new animation and select this here, here, and here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, for this we can select any. Okay. Oops. No, 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 no. I just wanna delete this dude. Chill.
Displays automatically in the game. So this kind of behavior we have to program. And that would be kind of an issue. Now we could manually target every single frame inside of code and then make this work. But that would be really annoying to work with, so we need a better solution. And fortunately, Godot has another better solution, which is actually one of the most important nodes you can learn about. That node is the animation player. And basically what it does is it plays an animation. Doesn't sound like a lot, but the reason why this is powerful is because when we talk about animation in this context, we mean literally any kind of change in property. It could be a movement, a rotation, animation frames, light energy, or literally any property of any node. You can also use an animation player to call methods on a certain node, and you get a huge amount of control over how these things change. So let's play around with that. First of all though, I want to clean things up a bit, and for that, I'm going to get rid of explosion 2. So let me delete it, and instead, with grenade selected, I'm going to add a simple sprite 2D. And this sprite 2D is going to get explosion 3. This is the one I actually want to use. So I'm dragging it into the texture. Now we get another kind of sprite frame. And on that, once again, I have 8 columns and 8 rows. Which means now we can animate via the frame what kind of image we actually want. And by default, let me set it to 0. Also, I want to rename the sprite 2D to explosion. That feels significantly cleaner. Cool. With that, I have the grenade selected, and now I want to add an animation player. If you just type in animation, you get animation player and animation tree. For this tutorial, we are only going to use the animation player. However, if you use more complex games, especially 3D ones, you want to use an animation tree to control the animation you have inside of the animation player. Although for now, don't worry too much about that. I simply want to add an animation player, and then we are good to go. At the bottom, we have another kind of editor that doesn't really have any kind of content. To change that, you have to click on animation. This gives you another menu, and in there, you can click on new. This is going to create a new animation. The kind of animation I want to create, I want to call explosion. Once you have that, you get a timeline. Right now, we have a timeline. You can drag a kind of indicator around, and this timeline goes from 0 to 1 second. Although you can make it longer, so on the right, you can set this to 1 second, or 2 seconds, or 10 seconds, whatever you fancy. In my case, I want to set the animation length to 2 seconds. For these kind of values, you just want to choose whatever looks best in the end. There's no universal value. You can also change the units, they're seconds or frames per second. The indicator, right now, we are moving in increments of 0.1 seconds. And quite a few more, but none of this really matters. What instead is incredibly important is this add track. If you click on that, you get a menu of what kind of value you want to animate. In our case, we want to animate a property track. So if I click on that, then Godot is asking me to select a node. And in my case, I want to select the explosion. Or more specifically, the sprite 2D that is called explosion. If I now click on OK, Godot is asking me which kind of property of this node I want to animate. In my case, I want to target the frame of the sprite 2D. And on this, I can click open. And now we have the frame property. And if I look back at the sprite 2D explosion, all the way on the right, we now have keys. This is because of this property that we have set. Or more specifically, because we connected this sprite to an animation player. And now with that, we can create keyframes. So right now in the timeline, I am at second 0. And if I click on the key next to frame, I have added a keyframe for this time. Which means at this time, we are going to have this frame. However, if I now go to 1 second, I can right click on it and insert another key, or to be more specific, another keyframe. And if I click on this one, on the right in the inspector, we get another value. So for example, in there, I could set this to 1. And now if I go further to the right, I can right click again, insert another keyframe, click on this one, and then increase the value by 1 again. And now if I move along the timeline, and let me zoom in a bit. If I now play all of this, we get a very basic animation. And if I move these keys closer to each other, you can see a bit better what's going on. So if I now play it, we get a really slow animation. It doesn't look particularly good, but that is a rather small issue. All we need are more images, and then we have all we need. Let me get rid of all of these keyframes and move the timeline back to 0. Now, with the explosion sprite selected, I want to get my start frame. For this particular one, I want to start with frame 29. So let me increase this a bit. And I want to start on 29. Actually, 28 might be better. Let's start with this one. So 27, this is where I want to start. If I now click on the key, we have added one keyframe and we have moved the timeline forward by one increment, so 0.1 second. Because of that, still with the explosion selected, I can click on this key multiple times. And every time we get the next frame inside of this animation, and we're moving the timeline forward a tiny bit. So I can do this multiple times, and I want to go up to frame 44. Or we can go a tiny bit further. I guess this one looks good. You do want to be careful here, because if you keep on moving forward, at some point you reach the end of the timeline, and then you would get some weird behavior. So in my case, I want to extend all of this, let's say 2.4 seconds. And if I now play all of this, we are getting and so in my case, timeline still with actually have all we need. Let me get rid of all of these keyframes and move the timeline back to 0. Now, with the explosion sprite selected, I want to get my start frame. For this particular one, I want to start with frame 29. So let me increase this a bit. And I want to start on 29. Actually, 28 might be better. Let's start with this one. So 27, this is where I want to start. If I now click on the key, we have added one keyframe and we have moved the timeline forward by one increment, so 0.1 second. Because of that, still with the explosion selected, I can click on this key multiple times. And every time we get the next frame inside of this animation, and we're moving the timeline forward a tiny bit. So I can do this multiple times, and I want to go up to frame 44. Or we can go a tiny bit further. I guess this one looks good. You do want to be careful here, because if you keep on moving forward, at some point you reach the end of the timeline, and then you would get some weird behavior. So in my case, I want to extend all of this, let's say 2.4 seconds. And if I now play all of this, we are getting an animation. So this is working really good. And this is the basics of what you can do with animations. Pretty much all you want to do is always add another track, then you have a property track, and then you select a node, and on that, for example, I could get the grenade. Now you can update one property of this node, and literally any property of this node can be animated. There's no limit to it. Also, what you can do inside of the animation player, we still have autoplay on load, and we have looping the animation. So both of these you could use just fine, like we have seen for the other animation. Let's say I want to autoplay this animation. If I now run the game, I shoot a grenade, there we get an animation. Although you can see this isn't ideal yet. We keep the last frame of the animation, so we still have to work a bit more on this. I want to select the animation player again, And if you click on the node and you don't get the editor, all you have to do is click on the animation at the bottom, and there we are again. I want to add another track, but now I want to call a method. And the method is going to be onGrenade. And now we get another timeline. If I now right-click on this, I can insert a key, and now Godot is asking me what method I want to call. Right now, Grenade doesn't have any custom functions, so we can only call the inbuilt ones. But that is all we need for now. The one I want to call is called Q3. This destroys a node. So this is the method I want to call at the end of this animation. And now, if I run all of this again, I can shoot a grenade, and by the end, it disappears. Because we literally destroy the node. I can actually demonstrate. If I go to remote and look at the projectiles, I can still shoot a laser, and we get a laser inside of the projectiles. And if I shoot a grenade, we get a grenade for a bit, but after a while, the grenade disappears again, along with the animation. So this is exactly what we wanted. And once again, all we need to do for all of this is an animation player. And this could do even more. There's a lot of stuff you can do in here. As a matter of fact, we can do an exercise with this one. I want you guys to add a red light to the grenade. On top of that, add another animation to the animation player and use that to make the red light blink for 2 seconds. The energy property of the light is probably what you want to use for that, but just play around. On top of that, add another function to the root node of the grenade. This function should be called explode. And at the end of the animation for the blinking, I want you guys to call this function. Pause the video and try to implement this one yourself. function should be guys to add, and this again, along with the animation. So this is exactly what we wanted. And once I actually demonstrate, if I go to remote and look at I can shoot a grenade, and by the end, it disappears because we literally destroy the node. I can actually demonstrate. If I go to remote, and look at, but after this animation, you guys to add a red light to the grenade. On top of that, add another animation to the animation player and use that to make the red light blink for 2 seconds. The energy property of the light is probably what you want to use for that, but just play around. On top of that, add another function to the root node of the grenade. This function should be called explode. And at the end of the animation for the blinking, I want you guys to call this function. Pause the video and try to implement this one yourself.
Why I can't do this? I wanna do this. I have a better solution. But we need the explode part to do damage. Let's do that part too. it works. It's not that hard. I like the part understanding some sort of concepts in one go.
First of all, I want to create another animation. So with animation, I click on new, and let's call this one blinking. Inside of this animation, we have a timeline, and we want to add a track. Although to animate a property, we first of all need the light for the grenade. And for that, with the grenade selected, I want to add another point light 2D. And let me hide the explosion for now, because this one would be distracting. Basically what I want to do is to have a light over this red circle. Also, the collision shape should probably be below the sprite, so we can see a bit better what's going on. Once again, inside of graphics, we have lights and the texture. There we have circle.png. This I want to use for the texture, and I definitely want to scale this down quite a bit. Let's say 0.3, probably too large, 0.2, still quite large. Okay, this one is definitely much too large. 0.01 is too small. 0.1, okay. 0.03 was the ideal number here. On top of that, I want to update the color. So the color for this one should be a reddish tone. And let's go all the way to red. And finally, to make sure the energy works, so we can add some blinking via the energy. This is looking quite good. Which means we can use the animation player to update this energy property. Although, first of all, the animation needs to be 2 seconds long, which means in the timeline, I want to set this to 2 seconds. Now I want to go all the way to the beginning, and at this point, I want to add a track, then a property track. I want to get the point light, and on there, I want to get the energy. If I open this one now, I can either add a keyframe with a right click and insert key. And let's say by default, this should be a 0, so we have no light at all. And let's say if we go to half a second, I could go to point light 2D, and I could add another key via the inspector. Both is totally fine, you get the same result. Although right now, both of these points have a value of 0, so there's no change. Instead, I want to increase the value quite a bit. Let's say this one. And to have a bit clearer numbers, let's go with 10. And if I now click on the key, we go from 0 to 10, which means if I play this, we get an animation. Cool. And now we can go to 1 second, set this to 0 once again, click on the key again, then we get kind of a blinking animation, then 1.5, this should be 10 again, and then I can go to 2 and set this back to 0. If I now play all of this, we get an animation. Although it's not exactly a perfect animation, we probably want to have some slightly faster blinking. For that, I want to move the nodes a bit closer to each other. And once again, I keep on repeating myself, but the more time you spend on all of this, the better it's going to look. And let me move them in equal increments. And what you can also do, if I go to the right part, you can simply duplicate a key. So if I click on duplicate key, we get the same kind of outcome. Now I want to get this one, and let's say for the last one, I want to increase the time to 2.1 second, and now for the final key, I want to duplicate this one, and now we have faster blinking. I guess this one works. And this animation is what we want to play by default on auto load. So now if I run all of this again and shoot the grenade, we get a blinking behavior that stops after 2 seconds. So this is perfect. On top of that, with the animation player selected, I want to call a function at the end of this animation. Now for that, I have to get to my grenade or the script on my grenade, and right now there's literally nothing. So I want to add a function that I called explode. It doesn't need any arguments, and in there for now, I simply want to print explosion. Really important now, make sure you are saving this script. Otherwise, the next step is not going to work. The next step being, I want to add track, then call the method. I want to call a method on the grenade.
Important part.
Now we get another timeline, and Godot wants a function. All the way at the end of the animation, I want to insert a key. And now we have from script methods explode. This is the function I want to call. And if you didn't save the script, you wouldn't have this final step. You wouldn't get this explode function. This is only available once you save the script. But with that, if I run all of this and I shoot a grenade after 2 seconds, we should get explosion. Cool, this is working. Although in this case, I don't want to print explosion. Instead, what I want to do inside of the animation player, I want to play the explosion animation. And that we can do quite easily. All we have to do is, first of all, we have to get the animation player and then the play method. Already doing that, Godot is giving us a couple of choices. Blinking is the current animation, and instead we want to play explosion. And now, if I run all of this, I can shoot a grenade, it blinks, and then it simply disappears. The reason why this doesn't work is because I have hidden the explosion node. So if I make this one visible, then it should be working. So now if I run all of this again, that is feeling much better. I guess we could refine this a tiny bit though, because this animation doesn't look amazing yet. Inside of explosion, and let me show the editor. There we have the explosion. First of all, I want to hide the actual sprite 2D. So if I hide this, sprite 2D right now is the grenade itself. I want to hide this around this part of the animation because there it's not visible at all. So another property track, I want to get property track, then I want to get sprite 2D, and the value I want to look for is visible. In there, I want to insert a key at this point, and you can already see right now it's enabled, but this should be disabled at this point. And at the beginning, when we start the animation, I want to have another key, and there it should be enabled. Which means now, if you run all of this, at some point, this sprite 2D will not be visible anymore. And this we can use around this timeline to add another track, a property track. I want to get the explosion, and on that, I want to get modulate. What this allows us to do is set the transparency of this animation. And it was up here. If I now insert a key, we get pure white. And this is totally fine. We can leave this as it is. However, if I go all the way to the end of the animation, I can add another key. And this one is going to be fully transparent. And now we are getting the explosion slowly disappearing. So if I now play all of this, the transition is a bit cleaner. On top of that, what you can also do is change how these two values change from one point to another point. And this you do on the right. There you have continuous, discrete, or capture, or you have nearest, linear, or cubic. This is how the animations change. For this one, for example, if we go with cubic, then we get some slightly different behavior. Although in this particular case, it's not too visible, but you can play around with this a lot and get the exact kind of animation that you want. But with that, I can run all of this again, shoot a grenade, and there we have a bit of an issue. So you can see we still have the light. And that is because the sprite 2D was hidden because of the animation. If I now run all of this again with the sprite 2D visible, now this looks better, and let's try an animation. This is looking pretty good. We probably want to hide the light as well. This could be a problem. Yeah, definitely. The light is going to be an issue. So once again, with the animation player, for the explosion, we have to add another track, which is a property track for the point light 2D. And all I really want to do is to hide the light entirely. So this is not hide, this is visible. At the start of the animation, I want to have the light visible, so insert key, it should be visible, and along with the sprite 2D, I want to hide the key, so on this keyframe, I want to make the light disappear. And now this should look better. And there we have another minor issue, but the light disappears. So basically, every time we are playing the animation, we are hiding the sprite 2D. That is because inside of this animation, whenever we are playing this, at the end of the animation, sprite 2D is invisible. I suppose the most secure way to ensure that this isn't going to be a problem, inside of blinking, all the way at the beginning, I want to add a track, a property track, then sprite 2D, and set visible to being enabled all the way at the beginning. And that way, we are not going to have the issue. I can now shoot it, and we have another issue. Now the light isn't being visible anymore. And this, once again, is because inside of explosion, we're hiding the sprite 2D and the point light 2D. So both of these, if we're playing the animation past this point, they are being hidden. So you can see it in the editor right now. This can be an issue. And once again, inside of blinking, all the way at the beginning, one more track, a property track, point light 2D. I want to set this to visible. And now I want to add another value to point light 2D in the beginning. This should be visible. And finally, let's try all of this. If I now shoot it, we get the light, we get the grenade, we get the explosion, and we get a transparency effect. Cool. With that, we have animations. And yeah, I'm happy with this. So this was the animation player, one of the most powerful nodes in all of Godot. And you can have a lot more animations in there, and you can do a lot of things. Also, when you look at add track, there's a lot more stuff that you could work with. I have only touched the surface of this node. I want to talk a bit more about animations. Specifically, I want to cover another concept called tweens. And
I think I got
tweens
this
are
part.
not essential to make a good game in Godot, but they can make your life significantly easier. At this point, we can animate basically any property using an animation player. The thing is, sometimes you just want to have a simple animation, like zooming in with a camera, updating a position, or changing the transparency. All of these things are quite simple, and as a consequence, an animation player for them would be overkill. To remedy that situation, we have tweens. And basically what they are, most importantly, they are not a node, although they used to be in earlier versions of Godot. Instead, they are an object that you create in the script of a node. And then this tween object can interpolate between two values. This might sound confusing, so let's do an example. We want to rotate any kind of node, doesn't really matter what it is. For that, we are setting a start value, an end value, and a duration. With that information, the tween object can start at a certain point. In this case, we would have a rotation of 0 degrees at 0 seconds, and then over the duration of 1 second, we would go through all of the values and eventually end up at the final value, the one we have specified. All of this would take just a couple of lines of code, no dedicated node, and is very easy to work with. Once again, here we are back in Godot. And what I want to do is that if the player is entering this house, I want to zoom in on the player, which means inside of the player, we have the camera 2D, and this one has a zoom level. If the player is entering the area 2D of the house, then I want to increase the zoom level to whatever value we want. Let's say if I go to 1, then, okay, you can't really see the outcome, but if I zoom in, this pink reddish area is the camera zoom. So if we change this to a 1, it is much closer to the player. Although this is not the value I want. For now, I want to keep it at 0.6. For that though, first of all, we need to have a bit of a setup. And first of all, I want to close the light fan animation and the grenade. We don't need those anymore. Instead, I want to work inside of the house. This one is now going to need a script. So I'm going to attach a script. For the template, I want to have an empty one, and the folder should be in the same folder where we have the house. All of this looks pretty good. Now we have a script, and next up, with the house node selected, I want to click on node, and then look at body entered. I want to trigger this signal once the player has entered, and for now, let me simply print player has entered. Also, while we are here, let me check the house area 2D in the inspector for the collisions. Those look good. The house is on layer 5 and can only see the player. Whenever you check collisions, this is a really important tab. It's very easy to mess up. Now, with that, we should be printing something. And let's test it. That's usually what you want to do very often. So there we already get an issue that we get players entered many, many times. Although we are also getting it when the player is actually entering. To check what's going wrong here, let me print the body that we are getting. And let's try all of this again. And there we can see the simple light is causing the problem along with the wall light. For those, we have to update the collision layers, which means I want to open up the wall light and I want to open up I called it the simple light. Both of those have the wrong collision layer. And I really want to emphasize this, you always want to keep in mind. It's very easy to forget. It should not be layer 1. Instead, it should be on layer 3 for objects. And for the mask, it can see the player, it can see the enemies, and it can see the projectiles. With that, we can save it. And then for the simple light, I want to have the same. It should be on layer 3 and can see layers 1, 2, and 4. And with that, I should be able to close both of these, run all of this again. And now there's no print statement when we are running the game. And if I walk into all of this, we are getting the player. And this works multiple times, so this is looking really good. That is a good start. Next up, I want to connect this house to the level, or more specifically, the signal we have just created, this one here. This needs to trigger a function inside of the level, which we can do via a signal. So I want to create a signal. Let's call it player entered. And instead of printing something, I simply want to get the player entered and then emit all of that. Now with that, back inside of the level, I can get inside of ground, we have the house, and now the house has player entered as a signal. This I want to connect to the level script, and now we get on house player entered. Just to make sure that this one is still working, I want to has player. Now with that, back inside of the level, I can get inside of ground, we have the house, and now the house has player entered as a signal. This I want to connect to the level script, and now we get on house player entered. Just to make sure that this one is still working, I want to print player has entered house in level. It's really important to always double check your code, and especially when you're recording, all of this gets significantly more difficult. But this is looking really good. So finally, we can start creating a tween. The way you're doing that is, first of all, you want to get the tree. This is a function that returns the node tree, basically the entire scene we currently have. And this one has a couple of methods. The one we want to use is called create tween. Also function, and a function that doesn't need any arguments. So this would create a tween object. This we want to store in a variable right away. Let's call it var tween. And now we have a tween, although this doesn't do anything. Instead, what you now have to do is get this tween and then run tween underscore property. And let me extend this window so we can see what's going on. This tween property method wants to have at least 4 arguments, but we have received 0 so far, so we have to make some updates. Also, a really useful tip, if you hold Control or Command and space, then you can see what Godot specifically wants for this method. And number 1, it wants an object. Most of the time, the object is going to be a node. In our case, the object would be the camera 2D. So inside of the player, we have a camera 2D. Next up, we want to have the property on this node that we want to change. Which means if I minimize this window and go to camera 2D in the inspector, there we have zoom. And if you hover over that, we get zoom. This is the property we want to address. And importantly, this property Godot wants to have as a string. So on string, zoom, the name of this property, and then we're good to go. And once again, let me extend this. We will need 2 more attributes. Godot wants to have the final value and the duration. Now, for zoom, the value Godot wants is going to be a vector 2. With 2 values, let's go with 1 and 1 for x and y values. And finally, we need a duration, and this is in seconds. So if you add a 1 here, we have a 1 second duration. And now Godot is not complaining anymore, and this should be working. So let's try all of this. And I can walk towards the house, and once we are entering the area 2D, we can see our camera is zooming in. So this is working really well. I can still do everything else, so I am quite happy with that. Perfect. I really hope you understand why the system is incredibly powerful. If the player is entering the house, we only want to zoom in, so ultimately a fairly simple operation. We could accomplish all of this using an animation player, but it would be way too much work, which is why you're seeing tweens all over the place. They make your life much easier, although you could get by without them. However, with that being said, if I run all of this again and I go into the house, so just a second, the animation still works, but the issue we have now is that if the player is leaving the house, the camera doesn't return back to the default state. And fixing that is going to be your exercise. I want you guys to change the camera zoom back to the start value of 0.6 for both X and Y once the player is leaving the house. Pause the video now. And try to implement that.
I got this.
I want to start
Was easy,
working
mate.
on the house because in there we have to attach a new signal, which is body exited. I want to add that to the house, and now we have a new function. Although this is local to the house scene, so we have to create another signal. Let's call it player exited. Once we have that, all we have to do is get player exited and then emit this signal. With that, we can return to the level scene, select inside of the ground, the house, and now we have another signal. This we want to trigger and connect it to the level script. Let me get rid of the white space and extend the window. Inside of this function, we now want to create a new tween and use that to update the camera once again. For that, once again, I want to create a new variable with tween. And this one is going to get 3. And then on that, I want to create a tween. On the next line, I want to use this tween object and then run the method tween property. And once again, we're going to need 4 arguments. First of all, we need an object, which in our case is the player camera. So I want to have the player and then the camera 2D.
People
Once again,
invented
we want to target the
Ctrl
zoom,
C
so
and
as a
Ctrl
string,
V
I
for
want to
this.
add zoom. Next up, we want to return to the start value, which was vector 2 and 0.6 and 0.6. Finally, for the 4th value, we need a duration. And just to have something else, let's say 2 seconds. Once we have all of that, Godot stops complaining. We can run the game again. And now if I go into the house, this should still work. And that is looking really good. And now if I leave the house, we are going back to the default camera zoom. And, well, we can do this multiple times. This works really well. Cool, I'm happy with this. With that, we have the basics of tweens. Now that being said, you can do quite a few more things with them. Although before I get to them, the debugger is complaining and this I don't like. Basically, we are using body inside of these 2 signals. And Godot doesn't like that, so we have to add an underscore so the debugger stops complaining. This is a smaller issue, but you don't want to have too many debugger issues. At some point, they are going to become annoying and confusing. If we now run all of this again, the debugger is happy, so everything is good. Now with that covered, we can look at a few more extra functionalities of tweens that can also be super useful. Right now, we have one animation when the player is entering the house and another animation when the player is leaving. If you want to have something a bit more fancy, you could add multiple animations on one tween. For example, what we could be doing. If I want to add another animation, I would simply add tween again, then use tween property once more. Let's say as an example, I want to make the player invisible. For that, I want to get the player, or the player node to be more specific. Next up, the property I want to target is modulate. This property covers the color and the transparency of any node. Ultimately, it is a vector 4 with 4 values. We have a value for the red color, for green, for blue, and then for the alpha values, which we cover with A. Now, in our case, we don't really want to target all of them. All we care about is the alpha value. And for that, Godot has a nice shortcut. You can use a colon and then lowercase a. With that, we are only targeting one value inside of this property. And this value we want to set to 0. Finally, for the duration, let's say I want to have a duration of 2 seconds. And with that, if I now run all of this again, I can move the player to the house. And now we are zooming in. And after we have done that, the player becomes invisible. And we still have the shadows, so everything else works fine. But, well, now we have an invisible player. Which is illustrating one major issue, that we are first playing this animation, and then we are playing the other animation. Godot plays them in sequence, which means if I turn all of this around and have modulate first, and then the zoom, you can kind of tell where this is going. We are going to have first the transparency and then the camera. So now the player becomes invisible, and then we are zooming in. Sometimes this is the desired behavior, but most of the time it is not. To play both of these animations in parallel, you would get the tween and then the method set parallel, and you would set this one to true or false depending on what you want. In my case, I want this to be true. Which means if I run all of this now, we can walk in there and we would get the animation and, well, we will get both animations for the camera and for the transparency. You might have also seen, let's say, if I type tween again and then set, you can also set a loops. So if you want to play an animation multiple times, you could do it with that one. Although I am not going to do that, that's something slightly more advanced. Or not really more advanced, just slightly different, and I am not going to need it. Instead, I want to cover something else. And that is when you are tweening a property, you can add a tiny bit more. For example, right now we are setting the player, we're getting the transparency, and we are only setting the end value and the duration. What we can also do is set a start value. This you get by adding a dot and then the from method. In there, you can simply set a start value. For example, if I set this to 0.5, then let me actually demonstrate what's going to happen. If I now run into the house, we are going to transition the player almost immediately to half transparency, and then we are moving to 0 transparency. By default, Godot is going to start with the current value of the player, which is 1, so full transparency. But if you want to have a default start value, you could use from. Besides that, you could also set a transition speed. For example, right now we are zooming in with the camera, and this works at a linear speed. But sometimes you don't want to have a linear speed. And for that, you can add another method called set trans for set transition. And in there, you get a whole bunch of different kinds of transitions. For example, I guess trans quad should be visible. If I now run all of this, you might be able to see this or you might not. For this kind of animation, it's a bit hard to see. So there we are zooming in seemingly faster, but we're not actually doing that. Let me draw this actually. When you think about transitioning any kind of property, you would have two axes. On the x-axis, you would have time, and on the y-axis, you would have some kind of value. The simplest transition to understand is a linear one. This one simply moves at a straight line. However, this is not always what you want to have. Sometimes you want to have an animation transition that looks something like this, or something like this, or even something like this. All of these you could set with set trans. Now in my case, I will not be too concerned about this, but this is also something you can do. Tweens are actually quite powerful in Godot. Although at some point, if you add too many things inside of this tween, you might simply want to use an animation player. There's no hard line between which one you should be using. At some point, you're just going to get a feeling for it, but both are perfectly fine approaches. In my case though, I want to comment out the modulate because this is not something we are going to need. Now finally, there's one more thing that I want to do. If I go back to the main scene, when the player is entering this area. So far, I can actually demonstrate this. The player can keep on moving, so this is not ideal. Instead, what I want to do is if the player is entering this area, I want to transition the player speed to 0. What that is going to mean is that the player is moving normally, and once we are entering, we are slowing down the player, so we are ending up somewhere here. That way, the player is never going to reach this bit, which would look a bit unrealistic. For that, we will need a few more things. It's not too much. Back in the player, I want to work in the script, and I want to give the player a few more attributes. Also, for those I want to use export, I want to create var max speed. This is going to be an integer, and this should be 500. Besides that, I want to have a normal variable, which is going to be speed. This one is going to get the max speed value by default. Also, we can be a bit more aggressive here. This speed should also be an integer. Once we have that, I can update this 500 with the speed. If I now run all of this, we are not going to see a difference, because as far as Godot is concerned, the numbers haven't changed. Speed is still 500. That being said, what we are now able to do inside of the level, when the player is entering the gate, this is happening inside of this function. I don't want to print things anymore. Instead, I want to create another variable, which is going to be the tween. And there's something I forgot to mention earlier. So far, we created a tween with getTree and then create tween. You don't actually need the first part. You can simply type create tween, and then Godot figures out the rest for you. So this is also perfectly fine. And also the more easily understandable part. So this is probably what you want to do. Next up, I want to get the tween once again, and then run tween property. I want to get the player node and spell this correctly as well. On that player node, I want to update the speed. The final speed should be 0, and I want to have a duration of 1 second. With that, I can run all of this again. And now if I go into this area, we cannot move anymore, although the duration was a bit too long. So let's say this one could be 0.5. And now if I run this again, in there, we cannot reach this ceiling anymore. This is exactly what I wanted. Now, right now, this is looking really silly and we are breaking the game. But later on, we're going to add a transition that the player is going to get into a different level. Although for now, we have covered another really important part, so we are good to go. Although before that, before I forget, the debugger now is unhappy again because we have this body parameter that we're not using. So let's say we game and speed standable type. Something is happening with the speed. If I now run all of this, we are not going to see a difference because as far as Godot is concerned, the numbers haven't changed. Speed is still 500. That being said, what we are now able to do inside of the level, when the player is entering the gate, this is happening inside of this function. I don't want to print things anymore. Instead, I want to create another variable, which is going to be the tween. And there's something I forgot to mention earlier. So far, we created a tween with getTree and then create tween. You don't actually need the first part. You can simply type create tween and then Godot figures out the rest for you. So this is also perfectly fine. State this and we score, and now I want to connect the laser to it. And this is going to mean a couple of things. Most importantly, I want the laser to disappear when it is colliding with a wall or an object. On top of that, if it is colliding with an enemy, it should trigger a function. For now, this function is going to do very much. Later on, when we work on the enemies, all of that will be much more elaborate. On top of that, there's one more thing I want to cover. And that is that the laser should disappear after a certain amount of time. That is important because I want to make sure that we cannot have infinite lasers. And the reason I think is best explained if I look at all of this in Godot. Back in the editor, I want to run the game, although I don't really care about the game. I want to look at remote, there we have the level, and there we have projectile. This right now has nothing in it. However, if I go back to the game and I simply shoot in one direction, we now get a whole bunch of children, and this can go on forever. Which is fine for the game, and for this kind of 2D game, it wouldn't cause a problem. That being said, if you have a more elaborate game, where you work with 3D objects, where things get much more complicated, you want to have a limit on how many objects you have in the game. Just imagine that the more objects you're creating,
FPS drops in
the more your computer has to process. So we want to have a limit on how many we can have. And for that, we want to have a timer that even if the laser doesn't hit anything, we still want to get rid of it after some amount of time. Now, for all of that, we have to work inside of the laser. So let me open the scene with Control or Command Shift and O. I can open the laser. And there we have a laser, and the laser has a script. We are simply creating a speed and a direction, which by default is up. And then inside of process, we are updating the position of this area to the. And then inside of the level, when we are creating all of this, inside of the onPlayer laser function, we are setting a position for the laser, a rotation, and a direction. So now we have to create a few more things. Most importantly, whenever this laser collides with a static object, then we want to destroy it. Which means inside of node, we want to look at body entered. Body entered because the area is going to collide with bodies, which are static objects or character bodies. So this I want to connect to the laser, and now we have a function. What we could be doing in here, for example, is print, and let's say collision. Now, if I run the game again, I can shoot at a wall, and we get collision. To be a bit more detailed, we can also print the body this laser is colliding with. So if I now do this again, we get a collision with the gate. And if I shoot in this direction, we get collision with the tile map, and this multiple times. So if I click on this, we get a whole bunch more. And this seems to be working just fine. That being said though, for this game, I don't want to print anything. I want to destroy the laser. And this we can do quite easily. All we need is the command Q3. This is destroying a node. And that is exactly what we want to do. If I run the game and I shoot at a wall, the laser simply disappears. The same works with the steam vents, and the same is going to work with these walls as well. With that, we have covered the first part, that now the laser is going to disappear once it collides with a static object. But this is not enough, because if I go back to the level and minimize everything, what I now want to do is add another scene. And the scene I want to add, if I click on Control Shift and A, I want to add a drone scene to my level. Let's say somewhere here. And now, if I run the game, the drone is going to move to the right, and if I shoot at it, the laser is also going to disappear. So this one is still working just fine. But now, what I ultimately want to do is that if the laser is colliding with this drone, I want to call a function. And for that, we have to figure out inside of the script on the laser, we want to get the body, which could either be a static object or an enemy. And on this body, we want to call a function if the body has certain attributes. For example, if the body belongs to an enemy. The way I approached all of that is, inside of the drone, we have a process function, and I want to create another function. I call this one function hit. It doesn't have any parameters, and all it is going to do for now, it is going to print, let's say, damage. Doesn't really matter what it is. What I now want to do inside of the laser, I want to call this hit function. What we can be doing quite easily is we can get the body and then call the hit method on it. And this would already work. So if I now run all of this and I shoot at the drone, we get damage. So this is working just fine. The problem is if I shoot at anything else, the game is crashing because we have a non-existent function hit in base static body 2D, which basically means that this method doesn't exist inside of a static body, which is the Steam vent. To fix that, we have to check if the body has a hit method or not. The easiest one would be with if, then the body, and then the inbuilt method has method. I don't suppose I have to explain what this one is doing. The one argument that this method wants is a name of a function. In our case, this would be hit. And if that is the case, I want to call this method. And now, if I run all of this again, I can shoot at a drone. It is still working just fine. But if I shoot at anything else, we are not getting an error anymore. And that is because this if statement is not triggering, which is basically covering the other aspect of the assignment. So now we can trigger a function if we hitting it, and now one beam event, the laser parameters is on the spot. We have to figure out inside of the script on the laser, we want to get the body, which could either be a static object or function. Also going to do that now the laser simply disappears. The same works with the tree. This is destroying a node, and that is exactly what we want to do. If I run the game and I shoot at a wall, the laser simply disappears. The same works with the steam vents, and the same is going to work with these walls as well. With that, we have covered the first part, that now the laser is going to disappear once it collides with a static object. But this is not enough, because if I go back to the level and minimize everything, what I now want to do is add another scene. And the scene I want to add, if I click on Ctrl Shift and A, I want to add a drone scene to my level. Let's say somewhere here. And now, if I run the game, the drone is going to move to the right, and if I shoot at it, the laser is also going to disappear. So this one is still working just fine. But now, what I ultimately want to do is that if the laser is colliding with this drone, I want to call a function. And for that, we have to figure out inside of the script on the laser, we want to get the body, which could either be a static object or an enemy. And on this body, we want to call a function if the body has certain attributes. For example, if the body belongs to an enemy. The way I approach all of that is inside of the drone, we have a process function, and I want to create another function. I call this one function hit. It doesn't have any parameters, and all it is going to do for now, it is going to print, let's say, damage. Doesn't really matter what it is. What I now want to do inside of the laser, I want to call this hit function. What we can be doing quite easily is we can get the body and then call the hit method on it. And this would already work. So if I now run all of this and I shoot at the drone, we get damage. So this is working just fine. The problem is if I shoot at anything else, the game is crashing because we have a non-existent function hit in base static body 2D, which basically means that this method doesn't exist inside of a static body, which is the Steam vent. To fix that, we have to check if the body has a hit method or not. The easiest one would be with if, then the body, and then the inbuilt method has method. I don't suppose I have to explain what this one is doing. The one argument that this method wants is a name of a function. In our case, this would be hit. And if that is the case, I want to call this method. And now, if I run all of this again, I can shoot at a drone. It is still working just fine. But if I shoot at anything else, we are not getting an error anymore. And that is because this if statement is not triggering, which is basically covering the other aspect of the assignment. So now we can trigger a function if we're hitting an enemy with a laser. Although you don't actually see this kind of method being used all that often, because Godot has a simpler way of doing all of that. All you have to do, if I get rid of it, you have to check if the function or property, in this case hit, is in the body. The result would be the same. So if I now run all of this again, I can still shoot at the drone, we get damage, and if I shoot at anything else, we don't get anything. So this is the same outcome, but a bit easier. Also more powerful, because with this syntax, you can check if a method like hit or a property is inside of a node. For example, what I could be doing inside of the drone, I could create an attribute. Let's say var is enemy, and this would be a boolean, which by default is true. This notably is an attribute, not a method. So we cannot call it. But inside of the laser, we don't really care about it. We could simply check if is enemy is in the body, then we can print is an enemy. If I now run this again, I can shoot at it, and we get is an enemy. And this we don't get anywhere else. Although this isn't actually what I want to do. So I'm going to get rid of it. Also in the drone, we don't want to check if this is an enemy. Cool. With that, we have another really important bit. Now we can call a method on an enemy, and we can also get rid of the laser if we have a static object. Now, we have another way to damage an enemy, and that is via a grenade. And for now, I'm going to ignore this one, because later on we have to cover static object. Now, we have another way to damage an enemy, and that is via a grenade. And for now, I'm going to ignore this one, because later on we have to cover another concept to make all of this work efficiently. So don't worry about this one for now. Finally, I want to create the third part, and that is that we want to get rid of the laser after a certain amount of time, even if it doesn't hit anything. And that is going to be your exercise. Basically, what I want you guys to do is to use a timer to destroy the laser after 2 seconds, or basically whatever amount of time you think is appropriate. Pause the video now and try to implement this one. Back in Godot, I want to keep on working in the laser, and since we now want to use a timer, I have to attach to this laser another node, which would be a timer. I'm going to call this the self-destruct timer. This self-destruct timer inside of the inspector is going to have a wait time of 2 seconds. One shot should be enabled, but auto start should not be enabled. Once we have that, inside of this script, we basically want to start this timer once the node has been created. And for that, we will need the ready function. So func_ready. And once it is ready, I want to get the self-destruct timer and then start it. That's the first part. The second part is once the timer is running out, then I want to call the timeout method and connect it to the laser. All this one has to do, if I get rid of pass, we want to Q3, meaning we want to destroy this node. And with that, we should be done. So now if I run this, I can shoot all the way to the right. And if I now look at remote level projectiles, right now it's empty. Let's try this again. We get a laser for a short period of time. So there we have a laser, and there it disappears. And this to the player would never be visible because the laser leaves the screen really quickly. But, well, we make sure that we never have too many lasers. And with that, we have connected our laser to the level scene, which is another major part of the game. So with that, we have made a huge amount of progress. At this point, we are able to create a single level, but that is still quite limited. So in this part, we are going to cover how to create multiple levels.
Yeah. I wanna learn this part very well, so I'm a little bit tired. Tomorrow's stream, actually today's for me. I will learn this. Today is the good progression one.